I have a skill testing question for you. Which of these paintings is the odd one out? Michelangelo's ceiling fresco in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, painted between 1508 and 1512. Raphael's School of Athens, painted in the Vatican in about 1510. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, painted in Milan between 1494 and 1498. Or the Boxing Boys of Akrotiri, painted on the Greek island of Santorini in about 1600 BC. The answer is The Last Supper, and the difference is that the other three paintings are all frescoes. And it's this difference, the fresco technique, that makes the other three paintings so much more durable than The Last Supper, which was not painted in fresco. Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King, and this is Renaissance Discoveries, in which we look at the innovations, discoveries, rediscoveries, and masterpieces made in Italy during the Renaissance. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at the art of fresco painting as it developed in the 13, 14, and 1500s. But as always, we're going to take the long view and go back to the ancient civilizations whose artistry and technologies inspired the men who created what we call the Renaissance. During the Italian Renaissance, fresco is said to be the sweetest and subtlest technique that exists. So what is this technique and how is it done? The first thing to know about fresco painting is that it's simple in conception. You paint with watercolors on wet plaster. The word fresco, or in Italian, affresco, comes from the fact that it was painted a fresco, in the fresh, that is, on fresh or wet plaster. Specifically, and this is one of the keys to fresco, on lime plaster, plaster that had been made with limestone. The second thing to know is that painting in watercolor on wet lime plaster may be simple in conception, but it's difficult in execution. And in fact, the technique was extremely and famously difficult to master, fraught with all sorts of possibilities for mistakes and failures. The artist and writer Giorgio Vasari, who was a frescoist himself and a friend of Michelangelo, claimed that most artists could succeed in tempera and oil, but only a few triumphed at fresco. He said it was the most manly, the most certain, and the most durable of all other methods. One of his contemporaries, a guy named Giovanni Paolo Lomazzo, saw fresco as a distinctly macho pursuit, something for artistic he-men. He claimed that tempera painting, in comparison to fresco, was the domain of effeminate young men. Which brings us to the third thing to know. Because it was so difficult, it became prestigious, the most prestigious medium of painting. And if you think about it, most of the great reputations in Italian art between, say, 1300 and 1600 were made in fresco. All the big guns of Italian painting, from Giotto around 1300 to Michelangelo 200 years later, proved their worth by tackling this difficult medium. Leonardo, incidentally, is one of the few with a huge reputation who didn't work in the medium. I'll come to him in a bit, but first let's look at how it developed and how it was done. We humans love to decorate the walls of our homes. We've done it since the dawn of time, or at least since Paleolithic times. The horses and giant cows in these wall paintings at Lescot in France are 17,000 years old. The animals in the caves at Chauvet, also in France, are 36,000 years old. And this warty pig, only recently discovered, was painted during the Ice Age in a cave in Indonesia, and it might be more than 45,000 years old. These works are not frescoes because they weren't painted on wet plaster. They were simply done on the walls of the caves. But if we move forward a few tens of thousands of years, we come to some point around 1600 BC, somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps on the island of Crete, where someone made an interesting discovery, a new technique of adding pigments to a wall. It involved spreading lime plaster onto the wall, that is, plaster made from a mixture of sand and crushed limestone. After the plaster was spread onto the wall, the artist added watercolor pigments to the surface before the plaster dried. That's what was done with the boxing boys of Akrotiri. It was also done for the wall paintings at the palace of Knossos on the island of Crete. The frescoes at Knossos date from around 1400 BC. Now, I should say there's still debate about whether pigments in some of these ancient paintings adhered to the walls thanks to a binder such as egg yolk, the binder used in temper paint, for example. But even if that's the case, the craftsmen certainly knew the principle of painting in what later came to be known as fresco, and many of the pigments in these works were added when the coat of plaster was wet. So, if wet plaster is the secret behind this technique, how does it work? The beauty of fresco is that the plaster, as it dries, protects the pigments in a very special way. The science behind fresco painting involves a series of chemical combinations. The lime plaster is, chemically speaking, calcium hydroxide. The first step in making the plaster is to heat limestone in a kiln. The heat drives off the stone's carbonic acid and turns it into a white powder known as quicklime or burnt lime, which then turns into calcium hydroxide when it's slaked or mixed with water. Calcium hydroxide is the magical ingredient behind the art of fresco. Once it's mixed with sand and applied to the wall, the series of chemical transformations gradually begin reversing themselves as the painter works. The water evaporates as the plaster dries, then the calcium oxide reacts with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to form calcium carbonate, the main component of limestone and marble. So in a short space of time, in the course of a day or so, the plaster spread across the wall turns back into stone. And if you apply your paints during this chemical process, during this short window of opportunity, the colors will be permanently locked into the crystals of calcium carbonate, thus making fresco, as Vasari said, the most durable type of painting, because the paint will not flake off the wall. The pigments become part of the wall itself as they quite literally turn into stone. From the Eastern Mediterranean, this technique eventually crossed into Italy. Not surprisingly, since after about 800 BC, many people from Greece and its islands emigrated to the Italian peninsula. A large part of the south of the peninsula was known as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. These are paintings from Magna Graecia, from what's known as the Tomb of the Diver, done about 470 BC in the Greek city of Poseidonia, which the Romans, after their conquest of Magna Graecia, called Paestum. One theory about this tomb is that it was done not for a Greek, but for an Etruscan who lived in Poseidonia. And that seems feasible because it's very similar to the frescoes we find painted around the same time in Etruscan tombs in Etruria, that is, in and around present-day Tuscany. And at this point, it behooves me to point out that I happen to have a video on the fun-loving Etruscans that I simply cannot recommend too highly. Fresco painting has been found in numerous Etruscan tombs in places such as Tarquinia, Cerveteri, and Orvieto. This is one of them, the so-called Tomb of the Leopards at Tarquinia, some 50 miles north of Rome, done just after 500 BC. The technique of fresco was then picked up by the culture that followed the Etruscans as the powerhouse in central Italy, and then, of course, far beyond, the Romans. And it was the Romans who brought this technique to perfection. We know quite a lot about their practice of fresco because of A, archaeological finds, including those at Pompeii, and B, the writings of the Romans themselves, some of whom describe it for us. The writer who tells us the most was an architect named Vitruvius, who lived during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. He wrote a treatise on architecture in which he gives instructions on how to plaster a wall and then paint it. Vitruvius describes laying down 6 layers of lime plaster, each one thinner than the last, with marble dust added to the mixture of limestone and sand in the top 3 coats. Crucially, the painting is done when the final coat is still wet. Vitruvius describes how once the top coat of plaster dried, hot wax was added to the surface, which was then polished to a high shine with a linen cloth, a bit like buffing your car after a wax. It's often said that the technique of fresco was rediscovered during the 1200s, but that's not actually true. The secret of fresco wasn't lost like so much else was after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West in the 5th century AD. The early Christians used the technique on the walls of the catacombs in Rome, painting on thin layers of wet lime plaster, a technique they would have learned from the pagans. And in fact, the paintings may have been done by pagan artists who were hired by the Christians. Frescoes are also found on the walls of early Christian churches. One of the best examples is here at Santa Maria Antiqua in the Roman Forum. The walls were decorated with frescoes done in various stages between the 6th and the 9th centuries. Or again, here we have frescoes in the Church of San Clemente in Rome. These paintings in the lower basilica date from the end of the 11th century and the beginning of the 12th. It's really in the next century, though, after the middle of the 1200s, that fresco painting comes into its own, mainly because of the greater opportunities due to various building campaigns, because you can't paint frescoes if you don't have churches on whose walls you can paint them. But fresco also comes into its own at this time because of the stylistic innovations of a number of artistic geniuses, the first of these big guns of Italian art. These are the guys who use the old technique, but use it to create much more persuasive and convincing images. And the very first of them is a painter from Rome named Pietro Cavallini. He's someone who should be much better known than he is. He was born in about 1240, and he lived supposedly until the age of 100. Much of Cavallini's fresco work has been lost, unfortunately, including what was probably one of the most famous paintings of the 1200s, his huge fresco cycle in the Roman Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. It was completely lost during a fire that devastated the building in July 1823. But this fresco in Santa Cecilia in Trastevere, which was rediscovered in 1900, gives us a clue as to why Cavallini became so famous. And believe me, he did become famous. There's a kinetic energy and a life that's been missing from art for many centuries. There's an attention to bodily form, to how light falls on the clothing, and how the clothing drapes itself on the body, which has weight and volume, and which is developed through gradations of tone. All in all, Cavallini's work has an elegance and a repose that looks back to the classical world. There's a kind of humanity to it similar to and perhaps inspired by the lessons and humanity of St. Francis of Assisi a generation or so earlier. Works by Cavallini influenced a guy who was about 20 years younger than him and grew up in Florence. That is, Giotto, who was born in 1267 and who went to Rome, who knows when, maybe in the 1290s or very early 1300s. Unfortunately, we just don't know too much about the life and travels of Giotto. But in any case, he would have seen and admired Cavallini's work in Rome. Let's look at how Giotto proceeded here in Padua, in the Scrovegni or Arena Chapel, one of the most beautiful buildings you'll ever see. He painted this fresco cycle in this brand new chapel in 2 years between 1303 and 1305. And he, like Cavallini, combined technical perfection with sheer genius of artistry and storytelling. Just looking at the inside of the chapel, we can see the great benefit of fresco. It allowed stories to be told in large scale and in living color, stories that everyone in the congregation could see, learn from, and appreciate. In this case, stories of the lives of Christ and the Virgin Mary, with a scary Last Judgment on the counter facade to concentrate your mind as you shuffled out of church after the sermon. Frescoes were the great storytelling medium, the means by which episodes from the life of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints were made visible and meaningful to the faithful, even to, perhaps especially, the illiterate. This is like going to the cinema and seeing a narrative unfold before you in Technicolor or in CGI. No other art form or medium could give you this kind of immersive experience, and no other medium gave the artist such a broad canvas, figuratively speaking, on which to showcase his talents. And let's face it, few could do it as well as Giotto. Let's look at how he painted this scene, the rejection of Joachim's sacrifice. Joachim is the father of the Virgin Mary, but at this point in the story, he and his wife, Saint Anne, both of whom are no spring chickens, don't have any kids. And for that reason, because he's childless, Joachim is refused entry into the temple to make a sacrifice of the little lamb that he cradles in his arms. Meanwhile, inside the temple, we can see the priest giving a blessing to the smug and no doubt highly fertile younger man, even as poor Joachim is given the bum's rush. And this is what makes Giotto Giotto. Look at the sadness and gentle indignation on Joachim's face, and at the lamb that, cradled in his arms, is like the child he doesn't have. Really heartbreaking stuff. This is an art that emotionally engages you, that involves you in the story of, in this case, the maternal grandfather of Jesus. Giotto and his team took 9 days to paint this episode. We know this because of the patches of plaster, of which there are 9, each representing one giornata di lavoro, or day's work. Plaster stays wet, depending on the weather, for no more than 12 to 24 hours. And since after this period, the plaster no longer absorbs the pigments, it was laid down only in an area the frescoist could complete in a single day. Hence, it's called the giornata. The large surface of a wall would therefore be divided into this patchwork of giornate, all differing widely in size and shape. So Giotto and his team would have turned up at the chapel at 8 in the morning, hoping the plaster had arrived an hour or so earlier, and applied the lime plaster to the particular spot on the wall where Giotto wanted to paint, the patch marked area number 1, for example. Technically, this coat became known as the intonaco, which was spread over an earlier, rougher coat called the arriccio. Once the intonaco was on the wall, Giotto and the team then had some 8, 10, 12 hours to add their pigments to this patch of plaster before it dried. It would have been a race against the clock as they worked on details such as the foliate capitals and the spiral fluting of the ciborium. Now, this is what made working in fresco radically different from painting an altarpiece on a wooden panel. Someone working in tempera or oil paint could retouch their work from day to day as they went along. But a frescoist needed to nail down each fragment of the scene on its designated day. Speed and decisiveness were therefore of the essence. You couldn't take yourself off for a 3-hour lunch break or mid-afternoon nap. You had to keep at it. A number of frescoists adopted the habit of working with a brush in each hand, each charged with a different color. The quickest brushes in Italy apparently belonged to a guy named Amico Aspertini, who worked in the early 1500s. He painted with both hands at once, with his paints in pots on a belt at his waist. On day 2, then, Giotto and his team would turn up again and paint on the adjacent patch of plaster, once again working against the clock, this time on the pulpit and its stairs. Day 3 then gets interesting. Look at how small this giornata is. As on days 6 and 7, Giotto concentrates all his time and effort on just a few square inches, because he's painting the facial features and the rather impressive beards of the priests and Joachim, something much harder than painting architectural details. Now, if he got to day 4 and decided that he didn't like what he'd done on day 3 or day 2, there was only one remedy. If you were working on an altarpiece, you could simply overpaint your mistakes. But the frescoist couldn't fix things so easily. If he realized the mistake before the plaster dried, he could try wiping it from the wall with a wet brush, applying it afresh and resuming work. Otherwise, there was nothing for it but to take a hammer and chisel to the dried plaster, removing the whole of the giornata and starting again, something that happened to the best of them, including even to Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. Now, how did Giotto and other frescoists transfer their designs onto the wall? We have a good description of the process from someone who trained with someone who trained with someone who trained with Giotto, a guy named Cennino Cennini, who in the 1430s wrote a handbook on painting. He describes a technique that goes back at least as far as the ancient Romans. In other words, how frescoists first of all drew their designs in charcoal onto the arriccio, the undercoat of rough plaster. They then went over the charcoal in a reddish-brown pigment called sinopia, giving themselves a kind of rough sketch of the final design. This is a great example by a younger contemporary of Giotto named Buffalmacco, and we can see not only the overall design of the painting, but also the very minutely considered details. It's a full-scale sketch of the fresco done on the dry plaster. The intonaco was then plastered over the part of the wall to be painted during the giornata, obviously covering up the sinopia. And so you would have to paint onto the intonaco with a kind of after image of the sinopia in your head. This method was obviously far from perfect, and later in the 1400s, a new method came into use. This innovation came about because the Italians of the 1400s had something that the Etruscans, the Romans, and the early Christians did not, something that was in very short supply even in Giotto's day, and that was paper, because the first paper mills opened in Italy only in the late 1200s. And so artists could begin using paper, or in Italian, carta, to make templates. They made them from large sheets of thick paper, or cartone, hence cartoon, on which they drew their designs. After the intonaco was spread, the cartoon was fixed to the fresh plaster with small nails, and its design was transferred by one of two methods. The first was called spolvero, and it involved perforating the lines of the drawing on the cartoon with thousands of little holes through which powdered charcoal was sprinkled or pounced by striking the cartoon with the pounce bag, this cloth bag, and leaving on the plaster an outline that was then quickly reinforced in paint. In the second, much quicker method, the artist traced over the chalk or charcoal on the cartoon with the point of a stylus, leaving marks on the fresh plaster beneath. Cartoons were obviously disposable. They were cut up into giornate, riddled with pinholes, stuck with plaster, slashed with a stylus, and then, of course, thrown away at the end of the giornata. So very few of them survived. Luckily, we do have an example of a cartoon. This is Raphael's cartoon for one of his frescoes in the Vatican Palace, the School of Athens. It's 26 feet wide and 9 feet high. Raphael made two cartoons for the painting, one to be cut up into giornate and used on the wall, and the other to, frankly, declare his genius, to show the steps by which he created this masterpiece through his skill in drawing and design. Because by this point, around 1511, drawing and design had become, thanks to the availability of paper on which they were done, art forms in their own right. A fresco painter would usually dilute his pigments with nothing but water. Binding agents were unnecessary for the simple reason that the pigments sealed in plaster needed no further adhesives. However, sometimes painters touched up their frescoes by adding colors to the wall after the plaster had dried. That is, they painted a secco, or in the dry. In order to do so, they needed to mix their pigments with a fixative, something to make them stick to the wall. The benefit of painting a secco was that it allowed you to work more slowly, and it also allowed for a wider range of colors. Someone painting in true fresco, or what was known as buon fresco, on wet plaster only, was severely limited in terms of what colors he could use. Only certain pigments could be sealed in plaster. Many others could not, especially the brighter mineral-based pigments such as vermilion, a bright scarlet made from cinnabar, azurite, a blue that comes from copper ore, and malachite, a green also from copper ore, and also gold leaf, which always needed to be added with a glue or fixative after the plaster had dried. Gold leaf and these other pigments were part of the stock and trade of painters, painters of altarpieces, for example, but they could not be added when the plaster was damp because they couldn't withstand the corrosive activity of the lime-rich intonico, which is very alkaline. For example, azurite gradually turned green after coming into contact with the moisture in the plaster. Even more drastic was what happened to ceruse or lead white, which would oxidize and turn black, turning highlights into shadows, snow white robes into black ones, and pale skin into dark, and so forth, an inversion that made the fresco into a photographic negative of itself. And that's what happened here in a fresco done in Assisi by the great Cimabue. The darkening of the white is due to the formation of lead sulfide, black in color, following the reaction of the lead with the hydrogen sulfide present in the atmosphere. A frescoist wanting to use bright colors like azurite or gold leaf therefore added them to the fresco only after the intonico had dried. However, this method had a major drawback. The glues used as fixatives were not as tenacious or durable as the intonico, and so the secco touches were always the first to perish. Giorgio Vasari warned of the dangers of this technique, pointing out that the colors become clouded by that retouching and in a short time turn black. Therefore, let those who desire to work on the wall work boldly in fresco and not retouch a secco, because besides being a very poor thing in itself, it renders the life of the pictures short. By Michelangelo's time, painting exclusively in buon fresco, that is, without any secco additions whatsoever, was imperative for an artist who wished to showcase his virtuoso talents and test the limits of his art. Patrons often demanded the more durable buon fresco for their commissions. In the 1480s, Michelangelo's master, Domenico Ghirlandaio, was contracted to paint his frescoes in Santa Maria Novella entirely in buon fresco, a condition that he in his workshop, which included the adolescent Michelangelo, expertly fulfilled. Which brings me to the odd man out, Leonardo da Vinci. As I said, he did not paint the Last Supper in fresco. He didn't like to work quickly. He liked to rethink and rework his paintings, something you couldn't do with a fresco once you started painting. He loved to work in oil paint because it stayed wet and he could continue to manipulate and tinker with the work for days, weeks, months on end, but oil could not be added to the wet plaster. He therefore painted the entirety of the Last Supper in a combination of oil and tempera on a dry wall. Now, all painters, including Leonardo, knew that oil and tempera paints would flake off the wall, but Leonardo hoped to find the secret ingredients and the magic recipe for binders that would make his paints stay on the wall, and it would therefore allow him to work at a much more leisurely pace, touching and retouching as he went along, and using bright colors and subtle details that he added at his leisure. The mural itself was a great success precisely because of this technique, but unfortunately, Leonardo didn't quite succeed in his aim. The work is an artistic masterpiece, but a technical disaster. And that's why the Last Supper is in worse condition than, say, Giotto's work done some 200 years earlier. Incidentally, anyone wanting to know more about Leonardo's painting and everything that went into the creation of the Last Supper is urgently advised to read a certain book on the subject. Now, I said that fresco was difficult. How difficult? Besides all the prep work, logistical problems, and mad panic of painting against the clock, you had to have a head for heights because you worked high up on scaffolding, often in uncomfortable and awkward spaces. Therefore, you had to worry about things such as health and safety. Just ask Barna da Siena, a frescoist who supposedly died in the 1300s when his scaffolding collapsed while he was working in a church in San Gimignano. Or just ask Michelangelo, who fell from his scaffold when he was working on his Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. Fortunately, he survived despite a leg injury. Michelangelo might actually have suffered more when he painted the vault of the Sistine Chapel. He complained as he painted about suffering the greatest physical fatigues because of the fresco technique, and he described how he had to work with his head tipped back, his body bent backwards, his beard pointing to heaven, and his face splattered with paint. He's given us a doodle here that shows us his painful posture as he worked. One of his worst symptoms was a bizarre form of eye strain. After spending so much time with his eyes turned upwards, he found he could read letters or study drawings only if he held them at arm's length above his head. No wonder Michelangelo later told Giorgio Vasari that fresco painting was not for old men. And I suspect frescoists would have kept chiropractors and deep tissue massage therapists happily in business. One of the many remarkable things about Michelangelo's ceiling fresco in the Sistine Chapel is that it was entirely painted in buon fresco, true fresco. He did almost no secco touching up. He deliberately chose this very difficult method, not just to preserve his work, but in order to demonstrate his virtuosity, endurance, and what Vasari would have called his virility. So Leonardo da Vinci chafed under the constraints of fresco, but Michelangelo embraced them. He worked with such amazing aplomb that by the end of his fresco campaign in 1512, as he reached the altar wall, he was painting directly onto the wet plaster without the use of cartoons, an astonishing daredevil feat of painting that had never been done before and that no one else would ever attempt again. Michelangelo was the greatest master of the technique, and he showed that even without using secco touches, he could cover the ceiling in brilliant coruscating colors. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe. Please watch my other videos. And please, if you want to know more about Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel, once again, you're urged to seek out a certain definitive book on the subject. And in fact, for more information on the frescoes and paintings and on the history of the Italian Renaissance, I have a wide and varied selection of books available, all of them waiting for you in your favorite bookshop.